I've played League of Legends for a long time. To be specific, I started playing in the summer of 2012 when Zyra was the most recent champion. And I've had this script written, scrapped, picked back up again, and sat just ready to go since the alpha lab for 2xKO back in August. Although great job on that past me, way to go and delete the footage I've recorded for that. So for this video, most of the footage will be from League of Legends itself. My first impressions of the game were very positive, even though I do still hate the title. I had a couple of minor nitpicks here and there, but it was very solid for an alpha build. While I quite enjoyed my time with each of the 6 playable fighters, my main thought turned to what the full roster could be like. Because while I didn't hate any of the characters, I don't feel like I connected with any of them enough to say I'd want to main them. In an ideal world, we'll end up with every champion in League of Legends being playable, although in a recent developer interview they did say that the Yordles might be a bit difficult to add because of their height, and honestly I think that's fair. Characters like Gon in Tekken 3 or Yoda in Soul Calibur 4 have been historic examples of why that can be a massive annoyance, both for the players and the developers, because they can just be an absolute nightmare to balance. I imagine as a developer it would be easier to scale a big character down than a small character up. As for the size of the roster, I think the number that's been floating around for the launch is 16, but in the end I decided to go back to the source material. League of Legends launched with 40 characters, so I'm going to make this a 40 character roster. Realistically, due to development time and development costs, this isn't really feasible for a launch roster, but hey, this video is just for fun. With 169 champions currently in League, this means that a massive 129 will be missing from my launch roster. Needless to say, this led to some brutal cuts. I should also note again that I wrote this back in August and don't feel like changing the roster now, so while both Ambessa and Mel were important in Arcane, and Mel is no doubt important in League's currently ongoing Noxus season, either of them are going to be in the base roster for this. My goal with this roster was to try to get a somewhat decent balance of playstyles and origins for the champion. I put my personal preferences towards and against certain champions aside for this, and just went with who I thought would be generally good or interesting picks. However, with only 40 spots available, a lot of fan favourites didn't make it into the base roster, but obviously they will make it into the game as time proceeds. Now, let's get started. Starting with Ahri, Yasuo, Echo, Darius, Illaoi, and Braum. Nothing to really say or add about these 6, they were the ones playable in the Alpha Lab test, they are locked in on this roster, and I couldn't get rid of them even if I wanted to. However, I do want to give each character one of their skins from League as an additional costume at launch. Yasuo already has his 2xKO original Blade Song skin, and Ahri already has her Dynasty skin, so that just leaves me with the other 4. For Illaoi, I'm going to go with her Snow Moon skin. Visually, I think it's her best, and honestly, I'm not a huge fan of any of her skins in League. They're kind of just a bit bland. For Braum, I'm going to go with his Crime City skin, where he has a proper vault door as his shield. But honestly, it was a freeway tie with his Luchador-inspired El Tigre skin, and his more knight-like Dungeons & Dragons-inspired Lionheart skin. For Echo, I would want it to be Academy because it's my personal favourite skin for him, but I could definitely see them going with either True Damage or Star Guardian. And then I remembered that Firelight Echo exists, and Riot really likes to put Arcane in things, so yeah, it'll probably end up being Firelight. For Darius, a couple of his skins could work, but let's be real here, it's Dunkmaster. It's Dunkmaster all day long. It is a meme come to life. However, God King and Woad King Darius would also make for pretty cool skins, and I wouldn't mind seeing either of those in the game either. So, we now have 34 spaces left to work with, so let's get this started properly with Jinx and Vi, the Loose Cannon and the Piltover Enforcer. Okay, I lied, we know that both Jinx and Vi are going to be in the game. They've been confirmed to be in active development, they wouldn't have one without the other, and the second season of Arcane came out in November, so yeah, they're going to be in the game. Even though Vi is definitely more suited to being in a fighting game than Jinx is, Jinx has still become one of the main faces of League of Legends. So yeah, she'll be in here. I imagine Jinx will be a bit of a zoner with Pow Pow and Fishbones, her Flame Chomp as being a stage hazard, and as I was recording this I remembered that they actually showed how she plays, and she seems to be a kind of a trap zoner who also seems to have a hammer. Honestly, her gameplay reminded me a little bit of Peacock from Skullgirls. As for Vi, I could imagine her being a brawling rushdown fighter. She wants to get in and just beat the opponent down. Maybe her E, Excessive Force, can translate into being a guard crush. For skins, I would go with either Firecracker, Star Guardian, or Zombie Slayer for Jinx. And for Vi, while her Arcane Brawler skin is more than likely going to make it into the game, I would personally go with her Warring Kingdoms skin. Is it because it's the only Vi skin that I really like? Yeah, kinda. There is one more character who was confirmed to be in development before the game was turned into a 2v2 fighter, but we'll get to her later. Now, I have 32 character slots to work with, so let's get this roster started properly. Katarina Ducoteau, the Sinister Blade. I lied, I'm mentioning her right now. Katarina is another character who we knew was in development from some earlier footage in a behind the scenes video. It showed her and Jinx, who was also later confirmed, so it's pretty much certain that she'll be in the game at some point, probably sooner rather than later. With her bouncing blades and shun pose, I imagine she would likely be a very solid hit and run type fighter. Being able to throw out her blades like Ibuki's kunai in Street Fighter and then shunpoing to them on the ground or in flight for potential mix-ups, cross-ups, and overheads. Her ult, the Death Lotus, would be a death by 1,000 cuts type of super as she just throws knives all around her. One of the older faces of League and one of the original champions, I feel like she's a shoo-in for this roster. As for which skin to give Katarina, she has a lot to pick from, but personally I would go with either Bilgewater, High Command, or Sandstorm, because while I'm not going to be using it as the basis for all of my picks, I really like a lot of the skins that recontextualize a character into another part of the world, with Bilgewater obviously being Bilgewater, Sandstorm being how she is in Shreema, and High Command just being her in a higher standing in Noxus itself. I would also include Mercenary Katarina in the game as well, but that would just be another colour for her base, since a lot of the early skins basically were just recolors. Lee Sin, the Blind Monk. Lee Sin is a mainstay of League's competitive scene and one of the most popular champions. He has been since before I even started playing. He could have tools to get in with his Sonic Wave and Resonating Strike combo, while also being able to cancel and feint it with his Safeguard and Iron Will. He could also potentially have a launcher with his Tempest ability. His ult from League, the Dragon's Rage Kick, could be translated into either a normal special or a super, where he just kicks his opponent around the world. I imagine for that we would take a few cues from Rain in Mortal Kombat and his kick that works in a similar way. So basically they get kicked off one side of the screen and reappear on the other. For his ult, he could release the power of the dragon spirit that empowers him to scorch his opponent. For which skin to give Lee Sin, despite the fact that he has so many, the obvious choice is Dragon Fist. It's the Bruce Lee inspired skin, and it's so popular in China that the individual chromas all got unique splash art. It was also his only skin to get enough attention that it actually got it to have a price increase when he got his ASU. Knockout would also be a solid choice, but that would require new animations because it recontextualizes him as a boxer, and I think it could be good to bring it all full circle and include Muay Thai Lee Sin, not only as a practitioner of the martial art, but also probably its most notable video game practitioner, Sagat, from Street Fighter. Nautilus, the Titan of the Depths. Nautilus is both a fairly strange character and a relatively safe pick. He would be a tanky character with lots of armor, he'd be heavy and hard to air combo, and he would have slow but hard hitting buttons. Dredgeline would be a key part of Nautilus's moveset, allowing him to both close the gap and anti-air, which could then chain into a command grab. Riptide could be a super that could act similarly to Magneto's magnetic shockwave does in Marvel vs. Capcom, to do chip and shove the opponent away. As for his ult, I'd make a command grab that either drags his opponent down to the depths, or hits them with his ult from League, the depth charge. As for which skin to give Nautilus, his options are simultaneously a bit limited, and also really good, but I would probably go with Subterranean Nautilus, although Astronautilus, Shanghai Scrolls, and Fright Night Nautilus are also all fantastic options. Honestly, I just think that it's still absurd that we never got an Anchorman Nautilus joke skin. Like, the joke's right there. Trundle, the Troll King. Trundle, the self-proclaimed king of trolls, armed with his club Bone Shiver, is next up to join the roster as a representative for the Freljord. Initially, I was thinking I'd just make him the most unga bunga, no thoughts, head empty character in the game, but then I thought he could actually have some interesting stuff. Trundle's gameplay in League is basically about creating a stat check by just stealing stats from his opponent, and I'd like to carry that through here as best as I can for a fighting game. For one of his specials, he could summon up a pillar of ice to block his opponent in, kind of like Aganos' walls in Killer Instinct. He could have his Chomp as a command grab to slightly reduce his opponent's damage for a short time, and he could have his Subjugate ability, where for a short period of time he drains his opponent's grey health to heal himself. Although I know that healing in a fighting game can be a balancing issue, so we might just have it drain the grey health away. When it comes to skins, I personally really like Lil Slugger Trundle, but I'd like to see traditional Trundle included. For those of you who might not know, some characters got complete visual overhauls, and one of them was Trundle. He used to look like this, and the traditional skins were given to Trundle, Sejuani, and Karma, turning them from these to these. Lee Sin also has one, but his is an entirely unique case. Ezreal, the Prodigal Explorer. Ezreal has been another mainstay of League at all levels, largely due to his high level of skill expression. However, as much as it pains me to do so, I think here he would likely either be a hit-and-run fighter, or more likely a zoner. With his Mystic Shots and his ability to blink away with his Arcane Shift, I think it just makes sense for him. For one of his supers, he would have his ult from League, the True Shot Barrage. Or maybe that just translates into his ult here. Ezreal, alongside characters like Jinx and Ahri, have been longtime poster children for League, and honestly I think him being a zoner really fits his character. Just shooting projectiles from a distance and no doubt talking smack and talking about how great he is, only to fold like paper when someone actually gets their hands on him. Ezreal is another character with a mountain of skins. He has the second most in the game as of the time of me making this video, and as much as I love his Star Guardian skin and will always adore his TPA skin, I think ultimately my choices came down to two. Either Heartsteel, mostly just to remind people that Heartsteel exists, or Pulsefire. And people remember Pulsefire a lot more, and it was League's first ultimate skin, so yeah, it's going to be Pulsefire. I've been playing a little bit safe with my picks so far, but you need to have some weirder characters to make a roster feel more complete, so we're gonna get a little bit out of the box on the next one. Yorick, the Shepherd of Souls. Our first character to represent the Shadow Isles, Yorick would be a strange fighter. In League, he's usually more of a PvE character, just split-pushing his way to victory through his ghouls, and I kind of wanted to carry that forward. So, in what will likely be the most bizarre comparison of this episode, I want him to be able to summon the ghouls and the maiden, kind of like how Jacko summons her minions in Gear Exard. This will give the opponent more than just Yorick to worry about, while opening up his offensive options. For his ult, I would like to call back to his pre-rework version, where his ult would basically just clone someone. So his ult would be him and a clone of himself, basically just beating his opponent down with shovels. It might be a little bit too morbid if I have him, like, bury his opponent alive. That's probably a bit too much. As for which skin to give Yorick, he doesn't really have all that many to choose from. Fun fact, Yorick came out about a year before I started playing, and he didn't get a new skin until 5 years after I'd started playing, once he'd had his rework. Part of me wants to just go with Meowrick because it's a fun little joke skin, but I think, just like with many other joke skins in the game, we could release that at a later time. So instead, I'm going to go with tried and true Pentakill Yorick. Jarvan IV, the Exemplar of Demacia. Our first representative for Demacia, Prince Jarvan Lightshield IV, joins the fight. Or I guess he's technically king now since Jarvan III died during the Mage Rebellion, but whatever, this isn't a video about the lore of League of Legends. Anyway, armed with his lance Drakebane, he would have long-reaching normals, his Golden Aegis would be able to grant him a hit of armor, he'd be able to throw out the Demacian standard and pull himself to it with his lance in order to close gaps, and for one of his supers, or maybe even as his ult, he would be able to use his ult from League, Cataclysm, which raises the ground around him to block the opponent into a small area. We'd probably be able to take a few cues for his moveset from his boss fight in the Mage Seeker, but I haven't played it, so I can't really go more in depth about it. As for which skin to include for Jarvan, part of me wants to say Dragon Slayer, but part of League's ranked experience has always been the victorious skins, and Jarvan was the first champion to get one all the way back in Season 1, so I think it would be a good callback to League's history if it was included here. Riven, the Exile. Armed with her broken sword, Riven enters 2x KO as a Rekka fighter. In League, her Q ability, Broken Wings, can be casted up to 3 times in succession, weaving her regular attacks in between them, and that's exactly what I want her to be able to do here. She would be able to do Rekka Part 1, land a hit or 2, Rekka Part 2, land a hit or 2, and then do the final part of the Rekka, which would act as a launcher. For one of her supers, she would basically get her ult from League itself, an install super to restore her blade, giving increased damage and range for a time, just like it does in League, and just like in League, it would allow her to use Wind Slash as another super. I imagine Wind Slash would work similarly to Zero's level 3 in Marvel vs. Capcom, where it's there, it looks cool, but you're probably better off just keeping the meter for the install super. As for which skin to give Riven, part of me wanted to go with Battle Bunny Prime to fit in one of the Anima Squad skins, but personally I think I would go with Redeemed Riven. It's one of her launch skins, and it isn't anything fancy, but I think it's probably my favourite for her. Zack, the Secret Weapon. The zoomorphous combatant, better known as Zack, would function as a kind of pseudo-grappler. He'd be able to get in with his elastic slingshot and then use his stretching strikes to be able to throw his opponent all over the screen. He'd be able to gain screen control by throwing his opponent towards the corner, or throwing for a wall bounce or a ground bounce. For result, I think they could really play with the squash and stretch of the character, maybe let him transform into something huge and stomp the opponent or something. Because of the nature of his design, Zack doesn't really have too many options for skins, but out of the options that he does have, the clear choice for me is Battlecast, which turns him into a liquid metal monster. Kha'Zix, the Void Reaver. Our first Void champion is Kha'Zix. He would start weak, but evolve as the match goes on. As he lands his special moves, they'll gradually grow and evolve to become better. This could make him a bit of a feast or famine type character, but I think that's fitting for the character both in playstyle in League and in general. Evolving the claws would increase his reach on both normals and specials along with their damage. Evolving the spikes could open up a stronger projectile, and evolving the wings could give access to a double jump, which could open up more air combos and cross-up potential. As for which skin to give Kha'Zix, I really like Death Blossom, but I'm going to go with Guardian of the Sands, partially because the visual of making him more of a scarab beetle is kind of cool, but also because it kind of gives him both Void and Shurima representation, and I'm going to be honest, I didn't get many characters from either region into the main roster. The Radiant Dawn. Our first representative for Targon, Leona, is going to join the fight. I knew I wanted her to be in the roster because her lore states that she's an incredible warrior, but because she's a support in the main game, that never really gets to come across too much. There was one cinematic where she was kind of going blow for blow with Pantheon though, which means she must be an incredible warrior. She'd be able to armor through hits with her Shield of Daybreak, but I'm not sure on if I would want it to be more like a defensive advancing stance, or just a charge with the shield. For one of her supers, she would have her Solar Flare, which would fire a large projectile that deals damage and puts the opponent into a stun state. For Leona's ultimate, I wanted to include someone else, but I didn't quite find space for her in the roster. So I would want Diana to be part of her ultimate as the sun and the moon combine their powers. That and the Leona-Diana shippers would go wild for it, so win-win I suppose. As for which skin to give Leona, I would go with Iron Solari. It's a relatively simple skin, but her sword and shield look really cool with it, and further solidifies her character as both the aspect of the sun and a warrior of the Solari.
Seems like I'm the one holding all the cards now.
Miss Fortune, the Bounty Hunter. Another representative for Bilgewater, Miss Fortune fights with her two guns, Shock and Awe. And no, that isn't a joke, they're actually called that. For one of her specials, she could fire out a shot, and if you repeat the input, you could double up, with each button doing a different type of shot. Either an anti-air, disjoint the two shots and make the opponent block twice, or to make the second shot enhance the first to deal more damage or more chip if it's blocked. With Make It Rain, she'd be able to lock down an area while doing persistent damage. It wouldn't force a continuous block state, because that'd maybe be a little bit ridiculous, but I think we could make it work. One of her supers would be her ult from League, Bullet Time, where she just shoots her guns at full screen. You know, now that I think about it, maybe I should have just made her play like Happy Chaos does in Strive. That might have been the play. As for which skin to give Miss Fortune, that's quite a task because she has the most in the game. As of the time of me making this video, she has 22 skins, just ahead of Ezreal who has 21, and Lux and Akali who have 20. Personally, I would make Captain Fortune her base skin, as opposed to her actual base skin, and I think I would go with either Crime City or Star Guardian as her launch skin. But honestly, I'd be okay with most of them. I own most of them. I may be part of the problem. Azir, the Emperor of the Sand. Azir is a champion in League whose very existence has always been meta-defining. Either he's not very good, or he is the meta. A lot of League's biggest highlight plays come from Azir plays. For how he'd play, I imagine he could be a little bit like Gargos was in Killer Instinct. He'd fight primarily through his summoned sand soldiers, and he would be capable of both solid rushdown and solid zoning, in order to give him both good offensive and defensive capabilities depending on the person's playstyle. While it may be a little bit risky on a 2D plane, perhaps his most iconic show of flashy gameplay is the Shurima Shuffle, and I would quite like to carry that through into 2xKO. Basically, Azir jumps to one of his guards and shoves the enemy back. While this could be used defensively to get people off him, it could also be used as an offensive tool to push the opponent into the corner and just keep them there. For his ultimate, I'd love for him to just summon an army of his guards to surround and attack his opponent, before hitting them with a concentrated blast from the Sun Disk. As for which skin to give Azir, I think I'd go with either Gravelord or Elderwood.
I see the faces of all over there. You look familiar.
Pyke, the Blood Harbour Ripper. The last Bilgewater character in the main roster, Pyke would hit hard and fast, but would be very fragile to compensate for it. He would have his Bone Skewer to pull his opponents towards him and his Phantom Undertow to side switch and open the opponent up. For his ult, he'd be able to drag his opponents down to the depths, similar to how Illaoi drags her opponents down to face Nagake Buros. Only instead of facing the Serpent God, they get consumed by a jawfish before being spat back out on the stage, or just consumed if it knocks the opponent out. As for which skin to give Pyke, I wanted to go with Sandwraith, partially because I think it just looks really cool, and also because this roster is still lacking in representation for Shurima.
All we need to start the fire is a single spark.
Silas, the Unshackled. Our final fighter from Demacia, Silas would function like he does in League as a melee mage. He wants to get in and beat you down with the magic his homeland persecutes him for. His chains would be a core part of his moveset, being used for normals, specials, and even just his normal grab. His normal grab, or even as a command grab, he could choke his opponent with his chains. His Apprehend could work as a grab to either pull himself to his opponent, or as an anti-air that could ground bounce. His Q ability from League could also be translated over, acting as a pop-up into the air if it lands. His ult would be lifted directly from League, and it would be that of whoever he's fighting. I know they would have to make all new animations for every character, and that would probably be a ton of work, but it's also Silas's entire gimmick. Maybe they would be able to just load a different colour model of the opponent, kind of like how when he uses a stolen ult in League, it's almost like a phantom cast from the original character. Similar to with Jarvan, there's likely a lot of potential for moves for him in the Mage Seeker, but I haven't played it to be able to take inspiration from. Sylas himself doesn't have too many skins to pick from, and of the ones he does have, I think I would go with Freljord. It's not the fanciest skin in the game, but it is a lore skin from his time in Freljord. And I believe that also ties back to the Lux comics, which I also haven't read.
Look behind you.
Shaco, the Demon Jester. Shaco is widely regarded to be one of the most annoying champions in League of Legends, and I wanted to carry that through here. I'd want him to be a tricky character to play and fight against with his Deceives and his Hallucinates. He would have an install super that creates a clone to function like a puppet character that still explodes when the timer ends or after it takes too much damage. Or maybe to make it just a little bit simpler, it could act like a hopefully less obnoxious Zero clone, or have Yun's Ganagin. Be able to set a trap with his Jack-in-the-Boxes. They maybe wouldn't do all that much damage, but interrupt the opponent's moves. His ult would be that you get jumped by an army of hallucination clones. Maybe the opponent takes a swing at some of them only for them to disappear, before Shaco appears behind them and just stabs them in the back repeatedly. Shaco gets next to no love or recognition in League itself, and I don't think he's even been mentioned for a VGU or anything, so I would like to see him turn up here just to have something to do, because he also isn't a character who really has any established lore in League itself, so they could really just open it up and do basically whatever with him. As for which skin to give Shaco, he has a good few to pick from. I've always personally liked his Royal skin, but it's just a recolor of his base, so that'll probably just be another colour from the outset. And while I quite like his Wildcard skin, I think I'd probably go with his most recent Fright Knight skin, although Soul Fighter and its Prestige variation are much more likely. Samira, the Desert Rose. Our next representative for Noxus is Samira. Her gameplay is all about flash and style using swords and guns. So, just like everyone else who's made their roster for this game has almost certainly already said, I think we just take some cues from Dante's moveset in Marvel vs. Capcom and let her go crazy with it. Her taunt in League is that she throws a coin which does 1 damage, but we could use this to call back to the fighting game favourite, Street Fighter 3, Third Strike. Some characters in Third Strike, namely Sean and Dudley, would throw out a projectile for their taunt, which would do a minimal amount of damage if it hit, but it was a stylish and absolutely disrespectful way to end a round.
I have no dignity.
As for which skin to give Samira, I think the obvious answer is Soul Fighter. She was the star of that event and the main character in the little mini-game tied to it, but High Noon would be a close second. Gwen, the Hallowed Seamstress. Returning to the Shadow Isles, we have Gwen, a doll created by Queen Isolde given life, a fragment of her soul, and a comically large pair of scissors to fight with. She would have some pretty long-reaching normals, and just like in League, she would be able to use the Hallowed Mist to phase through projectiles, if the user was far enough away, so she would make for an effective anti-zoner. Her specials could involve her needlework calling back to her ult as a projectile. For her ultimate, maybe she catches her opponent in a web of threads and does something from there. Obviously, it would include her needlework, threading, and giant scissors. As for which skin to give Gwen, she doesn't really have a whole lot of options to go from. So as much as I don't really want to have to dip into the same skin line too often, I think I have to go with Soul Fighter again. Either that or Battle Queen. If I'm being totally honest, Gwen was one of the characters that I had the least ideas for, but a character that I knew I wanted to be in the game. So that's why she's maybe a little bit less fleshed out than others. Jace, the Defender of Tomorrow. Jace was League's 100th champion, and he fights with his transforming Mercury Hammer / Mercury Cannon, so obviously he's a stance fighter, cannon at long range and hammer up close. He'd be able to use his Thundering Blow as a regular hit, as a knockback, or as an overhead. He'd be able to get a combo, end with a Thundering Blow to knock the opponent away, switch to cannon form, and fire a Shock Blast as a follow-up. He'd have two stances, but maybe not the best defensive tools once someone actually gets in on him. As for which skin to give Jace, I think that's a little bit up in the air depending on if they use his original League design or his Arcane design as his base. Although honestly I could see them including both. I fully expect Arcane Survivor to make it in at some point, and would quite like to see Resistance Jace make it in. But honestly, I'd be fine with any of his skins that aren't Forsaken.
Oh no.
Come on!
Warwick, the Uncaged Wrath of Zorn. So far we've been pretty light on monster champions, and I think Warwick is a perfect fit. Our final representative for Zorn, if there's one way I want to describe Warwick's fighting style, it's relentless rushdown. With his claws he would have decently long-reaching normals and super fast dashes to get in. Taking inspiration from his Q ability in League, that could act as a side switch, and he could have an install super that gives him access to combo routes that he wouldn't normally have. Weird example, but think of it similarly to Jury's Feng Shui engine in Street Fighter. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong. Alternatively, we could just make him play kind of like Saber Wolf does in Killer Instinct. As for which skin to give Warwick, I would personally go with either Project, Grey, or Old God. For a joke, I think maybe Big Bad Warwick could make it into the game somewhere down the line. I did decide against Arcane Vander Warwick, mostly just because I generally feel like it misses the mark a bit, and just looks kind of weird in-game. But hey, that's just my opinion on it.
I have faced many self-proclaimed gods. But when they die, you cannot hear their howls above the wind. The god died. The man lives.
Pantheon, the Unbreakable Spear. A warrior through and through, Pantheon is one of the few champions in the game to represent Mount Targon. And as the aspect of war, he's a natural fit for a fighting game. Armed with his shield and spear, he'd be a solid all-rounder, but would rather fight up close. He'd be able to throw his spear as a projectile, and have a charging dash with his shield, kind of like Captain America's charging star, that breaks through projectiles to close the gap. Maybe it could be charged as well to give a wall bounce. I'm not really sure how to include his ult, Grand Starfall, into the game here. I think it might end up just being used as his intro. As for which skin to give Pantheon, he has no shortage of really good ones, and for the joke I would love to say Baker, but given its popularity and everything, I think Dragon Slayer would be the way to go.
Poor lost souls.
Thresh, the Chain Warden. Another denizen of the Shadow Isles and one of the most unambiguously evil beings in Runeterra, Thresh is one of the best designed champions League of Legends has ever had. He does a bit of everything, and he does it well. He would be able to use Death Sentence to pull his opponent in, and potentially use it as an anti-air, or could use it in the air to pull his opponent up to him, with Flay potentially being able to be used as a launcher. The Lantern could maybe be used as a type of hit and run assist, going back to Thresh's origin as a support champion. You could throw it out, land your combo, and then pull yourself back to safety. Potentially this could even bait normals or supers on Wake Up. I know that it isn't how it works in the lore, but for his level 2 super he could drag his opponent's soul into the Lantern, where it would then be attacked by the other souls trapped in there, before being booted back out. However, if that super lands the finishing blow, they then just stay in the Lantern. As for which skin to give Thresh, Janitor is a very strong option, because it's a great joke skin for such a serious character. As a variation for his base, I would include what's normally his Chinese art, because they have laws and stuff around showing skeletons and the like, but also the metal mask just looks really cool. In the end though, I went with Spirit Blossom as my choice. Of the couple of times they've given Thresh a more human look, the common consensus seems to be that Spirit Blossom hit the mark better, where he starts the match as a human before gradually revealing his demonic nature as the match proceeds. Ornn, the Fire Beneath the Mountain. Another monster champion now, and this is one of the demigods of the Freljord. Originally, I had planned for Volibear to be in this spot, given that he's the more combative of the two, but ultimately I decided on Ornn for a little bit more variety. Just like in League, he would be able to summon up a pillar of volcanic rock, he'd have an armoured charge that could smash his opponent through the pillar, or any other player-made terrain, for a wall bounce. In League, it hits the opponent up into the air, but I don't really see Ornn being all that much of an aerial fighter. He would be super heavy and fall faster than most, making it harder to do air combos as him, but also make it harder to land air combos against him. His ult, just like in League, would be that he calls the Forge God, a giant flaming ram that charges his opponent. As for which skin to give Ornn, his options are extremely limited. While I think that Choo Choo is his best skin, I'd save that for a set of joke skins later, so I think I would go with Elderwood as his launch skin. Shyvana, the Half-Dragon. Shyvana would be a fairly balanced fighter with her projectiles and her Twin Bite. Twin Bite could probably be used as a DP. I'm going to be honest, Shyvana made it into this roster solely because I needed more Demacians, and as it turns out most Demacians are just really boring. But with Shyvana I could give her a literal dragon install, where she would turn into her dragon form. While it's active, her Fireball would deal increased damage, and she would have her Burnout Aura, which would deal a small amount of tick damage to the opponent if they were close by. Think of it like Reptile's passive damage in his Noxious variation from Mortal Kombat X. As for which skin to give Shyvana, she doesn't really have a whole lot of options, so I think I would go with either her Ice Drake or Ruined skin.
I have raised jungles, shaped lands, and commanded rivers. This world answers to me.
Kiana, the Empress of the Elements. Our only rep in the base roster for the region of Ishtal, Kiana would be another assassin in the roster, utilizing her ring blade and mastery of the element. She would have some normals utilizing her ring blade.
It's not a ring blade. It's an omlal.
Right, sorry, using her omlal and her gymnastic abilities, with her specials focusing on the elements, either giving her temporary camouflage with grass, increasing opponents' hit stun with water, or giving increased range and damage with rock. I think for her ult, it would have to have something to do with her actual in-league ult, or maybe we finally give Kiana a move that uses fire, because she can't use in-league, and that's actually part of her joke. As for which skin to give Kiana, I think it has to be true damage. It's probably her most memorable look, and it's full of all of the bombast that Kiana herself brings to the fight.
My prophet, your Empress has arrived. Witness your reward. The end of everything.
Malzahar, the Void Prophet. Our final base roster rep for both Shurima and the Void is Malzahar, who would function as a mixed bag, combining a summon fighter and a zoner, with a little bit of status thrown in as well. He would be able to summon his voidlings to attack and throw blasts of void energy for projectiles. His malefic visions could inflict various ailments on the opponent, either applying a small damage over time debuff, or changing their controls for a short time, or something like that. I had considered giving him null zones as traps to disable the opponent's specials while on them as well, but I thought that that could maybe be a little bit too much. As for which skin to give Malzahar, I quite like Shadow Currents, basic as it may be, but I think I would go with either Worldbreaker or Battle Boss. And speaking of bosses, Set, the boss. There's three things in life that Set truly loves: his mama, breaking necks, and fine Ionian silk. He isn't a fancy fighter, his plan is to get in close and just beat you up. His ult would carry over from League as just a huge command grab, basically just a giant jumping power bomb. His Facebreaker ability would be a grab to pull the opponent in, and depending on where they are on screen, it would do more damage if they hit a wall or something. And his W would carry through as a super powerful charged punch that would do a lot of grey health damage and guard crush if blocked, and just do a ton of damage on hit. As for which skin to give Set, honestly he has a lot of good options. I narrowed it down to Pool Party, Spirit Blossom, Heartsteel, or Soul Fighter. All of them give an interesting take on him, and honestly, I think they all just look really cool. Jax, the Grand Master at Arms. Jax is an interesting case because honestly, you could make him a rushdown character, a grappler, a general brawler, or honestly just a balanced fighter, and they would all kind of just work for him. Being the Grand Master at Arms, he can fight using just about anything, his old lore stating that he basically won with every weapon they gave him, so he had to fight with a lamppost, which has now been retconned into being the last light of Acacia, but again, this isn't a lore video. For his placement in this roster though, I wanted to focus on probably his most notable ability, that being his Counter-Strike. He'd be able to parry using his Counter-Strike, and he'd have his Empower as an install super. For his ult, we'd have to make something up for him. Maybe he just pulls out various weapons from all of his skins, and he just kind of hits the opponent with all of them. Or maybe he sets down the last light of Acathia and a void monster attacks his opponent. As for which skin to give Jax, God Staff was my first thought, but eventually I decided on Jaximus, partially because I think the Gladiator aesthetic really works for him, but also because of the reason why it exists in the first place. Quick history lesson for those of you who might not know. Jaximus was a skin made as a young man called Joe's Make-A-Wish, with the proceeds from the skin going to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. So by including it in here, Jax gets one of his best skins carried through, and the legacy of why it exists in the first place does as well, even 14 years after its initial release. Ideally, the proceeds from this skin would go to charity again as well. Wukong, the Monkey King. Our final representative for Ionia is the Vestian trickster Wukong. As a staff fighter, he would have good ranged pokes, and Crushing Blow could make the opponent take a slightly increased amount of damage for a period of time. While I'm not going to include Nimbus Strike as an attack itself, I do think it could be used visually as part of an air dash. For one of his supers, he could use a Super Crushing Blow, growing the staff to reach full screen. His ult could combine decoys and his Cyclone ability to allow him and a clone to really just lay a beatdown as the opponent gets ping-ponged between. As for which skin to include, my nostalgia says Jade Dragon. It was my favourite skin for him for a long time, although when they changed the splash art it really lost something for me. Seriously, the left is the original, the right is what it is now, and the left is better just night and day to me. Anyway, for 2x KO, I think I would go with either his Radiant or Underworld skin. Vladimir, the Crimson Reaper. Vladimir has a few potential avenues to go down in terms of being a fighter. He could be a zoner getting out of trouble with Sanguine Pool and pushing opponents back with Tides of Blood, but with his claws and magic, I think he could also be pretty good up close. Personally, I would quite like to keep to his identity in League as kind of a sustain monster, so maybe he could work a little bit like Mira did in Killer Instinct, and keep a reserve of grey health that he could recover faster by landing his specials. Tides of Blood would be a good tool to be able to push opponents back with, or perhaps even use it as a launcher. Maybe it becomes a super that just covers full screen. For another special, he could have his Hemo Plague, infecting his opponent so they take more damage for a short period of time. For his ult, I'd want him to cut the opponent up with his claws before blasting them up into the air as the blood just rains down on him, kind of like Suija's fatality in Samurai Showdown 5. Either that, or he pools some of his opponent's blood into a glass and just drinks it at the end. As for which skin to give Vlad, part of me wants to say Dark Waters, because it's the one that I personally use the most when playing him. But I think Bloodlord is probably the move here. It's one of the oldest legendary skins in League, and it really shows it, so I think including it here could lay the groundwork for a potential redesign later for PC. Now, before I get onto the bosses for the game, I want to introduce one more character.
I don't know, Book. Master could be anywhere. Where are we, Book?
Yuumi, the magical cat. There were probably two main responses to hearing that I wanted to include Yuumi in this game. One being how, and the other being why. Because, for those of you who don't know, Yuumi in League itself is basically the meme for absolute no-skill gameplay. Just sit on a teammate and let them play for you. And that's exactly what I want to carry through into 2xKO. Yuumi would still have specials and supers from her assist buttons and doing the super inputs with the assist buttons, but for the fight itself it's essentially a 2v1, but the 1 is made stronger in terms of both health and damage to account for this. My only real reservation about including Yuumi in this way is that I don't really know how I would include it for a 2v2 scenario without just greying the character out. Maybe Yuumi is one of the options you pick at the start of the match, kind of like Fury Freestyle Double Down or 2x Assist. That way she wouldn't be a full playable character per se, but would still be in the game and still have all of her functionality available. Since I've done it for all the other characters, it wouldn't be right to leave Yuumi out. As for skins, I think I would go with either Battle Principle, UB, or Bewitching Yuumi. I haven't included any of the esports skins, but EDG Yuumi is also fantastic, and I think that would actually be the best option.
We boxed them all. Now back on the prowl. Meow.
You don't belong here.
I have crossed through death and ruination to get back to her. Return, my queen.
You will destroy this world.
She is my world.
Viego, the Ruined King. The antagonist of the Ruination, the Ruined King Viego would stand as one half of our final boss duo. He'd be a relatively nimble and tricky fighter, able to get in but also disappear into the black mist to either close in or get out. For one of his specials, he'd be able to have a charged command grab that when it lands gives him access to one of his opponent's level 1 supers. Then if he hits you with your own ability, he could restore part of his missing health. For his ult, he could have a command grab that does damage and transforms him into his opponent for a short amount of time. Then when he transforms back, it could knock the opponent back. He would also be able to repeat the input to cancel the transformation early. And now I'm realizing that I've kind of unintentionally made Viego a grappler, but hey, here we are. As for which skin to give Viego, part of me wants to go with his King Viego skin, reflecting the man he was in life before the Ruination and his loss of his soul. But on visuals alone, and the fact that this is a fighting game, I have to go with Soul Fighter. I also have a second reason as to why I specifically wanted to include Viego that I hadn't mentioned until now. Misfortune and Pike weren't originally planned for this roster, but they were the only two from the main cast of the Ruined King game that weren't included. But now that I've revealed Viego and his purpose in the roster, I wanted to give that entire crew, so Misfortune, Pike, Yasuo, Ahri, Braum, and Alawi, the skins that were available as a pre-order for the Ruined King game. So with that, here we are at the final character for our base roster. Mordekaiser, the Iron Revenant. Armed with his mace Nightfall, Mordekaiser stands as the second half of our boss duo to round out the game's launch roster. To be more accurate, Viego and Mordekaiser could probably be two separate 1v1 fights, rather than a 2v2, because they likely don't really have much reason to team up. I don't know, maybe Mordekaiser found a way to restore his soul for Viego or something, but that doesn't really seem like his style. Anyway, one of his specials could function like Aganos in Killer Instinct, where he gets chunks of rock, or in this case metal, to add additional hits of armor. For one of his specials, he would slam Nightfall onto the ground for an overhead, and the longer it had been held, it could do more damage, pop the opponent up into the air, and becomes unblockable when fully charged. Doing the input for Nightfall backwards would cast Death's Grasp, pulling the opponent towards him and would hit low. Death's Grasp as a super would almost work like one of Braum's in reverse, coming from one side towards him and pulling the opponent closer as opposed to hitting them away. I mostly just wanted this to exist as a little callback to Siphon of Destruction, his pre-rework E. One of his supers, or probably his ult, would be the Death Realm, which would make the fight a pure 1v1 for the duration. No assists, tags, or dramatic saves would be able to be done while it's active. The boss version would still be able to call assists though. As for which skin to give Mordekaiser, he has a lot of good options. Old Guard, Grave Knight, Darkstar, and Project all have massive final boss energy to them, but you can't go wrong with the classic, and that's why I'm going with his Pentakill skin. Having Pentakill Mordekaiser means I could also maybe have Dissonance of Pentakill Viego, and make that his launch skin, so they're kind of in parallel to each other, even though they are like diametrically opposed. Or because I'm writing the bits about the skins way later than the rest of the initial script, I would also like to include Sanuzal, his original form in life, to maybe be his base skin. But considering the fact that League proper just dropped it as another $250 gacha scam, I highly doubt they'd allow it to just be a base skin in here. That brings our base roster to a close, but there's still a lot of champions not included. In an ideal world, I would love to be able to include every single champion in the game, but that likely just isn't feasible unless the game keeps going indefinitely. But since I included Yumi, I'm now at the weird number of 41, so I'll at least mention the first 9 to round it out to an even 50.
Not peace, not mercy, only
Blood.
Ambessa, the Matriarch of War. She didn't make it into the base roster because I'd originally planned for this video to come out last August or September before she was added to the game, but Ambessa makes it in as our first post-launch character. The Matriarch of the Madara family, Ambessa would be an aggressive rushdown fighter. Her skill set in League has her dashing all over the place and sticking to people until either they die or she does, and if that doesn't scream rushdown, I don't really know what does. She could have her Chain Lash moves from League as specials, and I think they should give her plenty of combo routes with her normals for strong mix-ups. As for which skin to give Ambessa, she currently only has Chosen of the Wolf in League, and honestly it isn't a great skin, so instead I think I would give her one based on how she appears in the final Battle of Arcane.
Show yourself.
Yone, the Unforgotten. Yasuo's brother Yone is next up to join the roster. Armed with his twin blades, he would be a high execution character with a lot of combo potential. He would have a charging dash with his blades as one of his specials. Just like in League, he'd be able to unbind his soul for a few seconds, allowing him to try to get in and open the opponent up. This also gives him the safety net of knowing he'll be dragged back in a few seconds, so knowing when to use it would be essential to unlocking his full potential and not just robbing yourself of potential combos. For his ult, once again, he would dash forward with his blades, with the visual being that he'd sliced the soul of his opponent. As for which skin to give Yone, just like with Yasuo, I think he should have an original Blade Song skin, just to make the brothers match. Or they could give him a skin that makes him Yone Wind Chaser, an earlier version of himself that we've seen in Legends of Runeterra from before he was cut down by Yasuo.
seeking glory only goes so far. Will glory be there for every failure?
Fiora, the Grand Duelist. Fiora is a solid pick for a fighting game, and in terms of what she could bring to the table for a fighting game, is one of the more interesting characters from Demacia. She would have fast sword swings and her dueling expertise, particularly in the field of fencing, which makes her a really solid character who has good combo potential, but really becomes unleashed when she lands a parry, opening her opponent up for a counter hit. But I have one request, nay, one demand, and that's that her old ult from pre-rework Fiora is used as her ult. It both works as a super to show her speed and power, while also being a good little callback to her original version that's mostly been lost to time. Also, Blade Waltz is just a really cool name for a move, and yes, I am using her old art for her icon on the character select, mostly just because I like it a lot more, even though current Fiora has been in the game for 9.5 years now. As for skins, despite the fact that she's been in the game for a very long time, I feel like Fiora's skin options are still a little bit on the limited side. Personally, I would go with Royal Guard Fiora, because it gives her more of a musketeer look, and I just think it's one of her best skins, despite how basic it is. Although I feel like a lot of people would want to see Headmistress Fiora in the game, and also just replacing her sword with a ruler is kinda funny.
Breathe in the wild.
Udyr, the Spirit Walker. Udyr is an interesting character, and his style revolves around 4 stances, which even after his rework, I still want to refer to as Tiger, Turtle, Bear, and Phoenix, so I will be doing so. Obviously, this is going to make him a stance fighter. Tiger would be his rushdown stance with quick, hard-hitting normals. Turtle stance would be more defensive, granting armor and reducing the amount of chip damage he'll take. Bear stance would be more of a bruiser or maybe even a grappler with setup to pierce through armor, and Phoenix stance could open up some zoning potential for him. While he wouldn't excel in any one area, I think we could give him a good all-around toolset that could work to mix and match to his strengths, to his weaknesses, to his teammates, and to his opponents. As for which skin to give Udyr, Primal or Spirit Guard is the obvious choice. Ink Shadow could be really cool, and definitely not Udyr has to be a joke skin at a later time. Gangplank, the Saltwater Scourge. Bilgewater has a few representatives in the game already, but when you think of Bilgewater, you think of pirates, and League's quintessential pirate is Gangplank. Armed with his cutlass and parley pistol, Gangplank would be a solid all-rounder. I would say that he could have a personalised burst move with the oranges, but that might be a bit too strong. For one of his supers, he would call on his ship to rain down fire over an area, calling back to his ult in League, ending with a final big explosion. And for his ult, it could work kind of like a game of pop-up pirate, where the opponent could be tied to a stack of barrels that he then shoots, setting off a chain reaction that just blows them all up. As for which skin to include, I initially considered Captain Gangplank. It was his base skin when his rework initially launched, before he quote-unquote died, and got the base design that he has now. But then we would have 2 skins that are basically him just being a pirate, so instead I decided on Special Forces, which then casts him as, well, a military Special Forces type character. While it would be another skin that kind of just makes him a pirate again, we could also use Gangplank the Betrayer, which is a lore skin tied to the Ruined King game. This brings him in line with the other 6 characters from the main game and Viego. Honestly, while looking at the skins to decide on which one to give Gangplank, I realised that he has a lot of them and I don't like most of them. Anyway, I'm still waiting on that Special Forces Misfortune skin that's hinted at in the background of the splash art.
This is the tale of a young hunter and his greatest battle.
Cassante, the pride of Nazuma. Renowned as a hunter, he would be a great fit in a fighting game. With his Ntofos, he would be able to send a shockwave to knock his opponent up into the air. He could also have access to a defensive stance where he could either be more armoured and defensive, or pivot out of it to rush forward for an offensive charge. One of his supers would be an install to go into his all-out mode, increasing his damage but also increasing the amount of damage he would take. This would give him a kind of risk-reward to his gameplay. For his ultimate, he'd go into full-on, all-out mode, fully unleashing his power, and the Ntofos would return to normal after the move is done. Alternatively, maybe his friend and former partner Tope could come out to help him out for his ult, combining their skills as hunter and archer. Although this may be a little bit too close to the concept that I suggested for Leona's ultimate, so maybe pass on this one. As for which skin to give Cassante, he doesn't have many options to go with, so I'm going to go with Heartsteel, mostly just because I don't really like his Empyrean skin all that much. And I'm just realising this now, but I could and probably should have taken more inspiration from Leo Whitefang for his move. Elise, the Spider Queen. A member of the Black Rose, Elise is a Noxian noble cursed on the Shadow Isles with her spider abilities. I don't really know how we would go about implementing her spider form for actual moves. Maybe she could be a stance fighter, or maybe she could just transform in and out of spider form for certain movement abilities and her supers. Part of me wanted to say that she's just a combination of the playstyles of Spider-Man and Sadira and call it a day, but I had a couple of other ideas. Elise would be all about using her webs to get an advantage. She would be able to set them up as traps for her opponent to get stuck in, use them to hang on walls, or almost like a jump pad for a better jump. Maybe she could have her spiders weave a web across the top of the screen and then she can skitter across it before rappelling down to get through zoners. For her ult, she would unleash not only her spider abilities, but also call upon her god Vilemore to attack her opponent. Alternatively, when I did the episode for a potential Darkstalkers 4, I had a spider character concept in there that I think could also maybe work, where for her specials she would be able to shoot a web to entangle her opponents, or would be able to put a web on the floor, kind of like Sub-Zero's ice puddle in Mortal Kombat. For another one of her specials, she could send a spiderling across the floor that then explodes into webs, that would then entangle the opponent to open them up for a combo. And she could have a command grab where she just stabs her opponent with her spider legs. As for which skin to give Elise, she has a good few to pick from, but I think I would go with Coven. Visually, I think it's one of, if not her best skin, while also possessing the kind of regal nobility that's befitting of the character. Kassadin, the Voidwalker. Another representative for Shurima and the Void here in the form of Kassadin. His Riftwalks would let him dodge through attacks and projectiles, his Netherblade would be good for combos with solid reach, and his Null Sphere could maybe work kind of like Noob Saibot's ones do in Mortal Kombat, temporarily disabling part of his opponent's moveset, blocking their specials, or maybe preventing them from gaining meter or something like that. As for which skin to give Kassadin, I think I would go with Harbinger, mostly just because it looks cool, or maybe pre-Void Kassadin, just to kind of show how he looked before. Galio, the Colossus. The Petricite Colossus Galio stands as the defender of Demacia. Spurred to life by magic, he would be another tank of a character. His giant wing beats could push the opponent back, and his Justice Punch could be a heavily armoured charge that gives him a wall bounce. Because of Galio's size, he would have to be scaled down a bit, but he would be a formidable ally and a powerful defender. Honestly, I kind of want him to have a unique ult that can only be done by his teammate, where he makes a heroic entrance to protect his ally. As for which skin to give Galio, he has a couple that I think could work, and I would love to see one based on his original design, but I think I have to go with Gatekeeper. It recontextualizes him basically as the demon and judge of hell. It basically just does a complete 180 on his character, and I think it's an interesting skin for him. So that's 50 characters, but as you can see, I have 10 more places on this roster, so I'm going to just lightning round through these final 10. Renekton, the Butcher of the Sands. Outside of Azir, I haven't included any of the Ascended God Warriors of Shurima, and I feel like Renekton would be much more likely to choose to fight than Nasus. He would be a super aggressive rushdown fighter. As for which skin to give him, my personal choice is Blood Fury. Rengar, the Pride Stalker. With Kazakhs in the game, it's only right to include Rengar. While he's an assassin in League, I'm going to make him more of a balanced all-round brawler. As for which skin to give him, I would go with either his Sentinel skin or his Guardian of the Sands skin to match with Kazakhs. Zed, the Master of Shadows. He'd be a super high execution and really tricky to lock down hit and run fighter. He'd be teleporting all over the screen with his shadows. As for which skin to give him, my choice is Deathsworn. Sejuani, the Fury of the North. A bit of an unusual version for Sejuani here, where I would have her fighting on foot, as opposed to riding on Bristle as she usually does, but she would still have Bristle for her ult and her entrant. She would have decent reaching normals with her flail, and I'm not really 100% sure why, but I kind of envisioned her playstyle almost being like Ivy in Soul Calibur. As for which skin to give her, my choice is Bear Cavalry. Either that or Poro Rider. Shen, the Eye of Twilight. Our sole representative for the Kinko Order and counterpart to Zed, Shen would be more of a supportive fighter, with his Shadow Dashes, Spirit Shield, and Stand United, to both defend his allies and get in on opponents. Yes, there was an abrupt cut here because I was editing and realised I was actually a character short. I even mentioned considering adding Shen to the game later. As for which skin to give him, I would personally go with Warlord Shen, but it's also very tempting to just go with either Frozen or Yellow Jacket Shen, and then have all of the other colours basically just be the Mortal Kombat ninjas, because that's what they were originally based on. Volibear, the Relentless Storm. Another demigod of the Freljord. I originally had him penciled in for the main roster before Ornn took his place. He would be a tanky fighter with claw swipes, bites, and crushing grapples. As for which skin to give him, my choice is the 1000-pierced bear. Diana, Scorn of the Moon. We already have her model from Leona's ult, so it was only a matter of time before we made Diana her own playable character. On top of that, we didn't have any additional Targonians as post-launch content. I did consider Tarek, but ended up going with Diana. Zoe was probably too small, and I don't really know how I would fit Aurelion Sol into a fighting game. As for which skin to give Diana, my choice is Dark Waters, which does basically just make her into Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower from Bloodborne. Camille, the Steel Shadow. She could be a bit interesting with her mobility options. All of her attacks would be kick-based, and I think she's one of the more interesting characters from Piltover. As for which skin to give her, my choice would be either Coven or Winterblast. Kayn, a Shadow Reaper. The duality of Kayn and Rast could make for an interesting playstyle, as Kayn would get stronger the longer the match goes. In League itself, the transformation is based on attacking ranged or melee champion. Yeah, it could maybe be determined by combo lengths or something like that. After transforming, the blue Shadow Assassin Kayn would be faster and more mobile with longer reach, but the Darken Kayn, or Rast, would have more armoured options and be able to heal part of his grey health with his Umbral Trespass super. As for which skin to give him, Heartsteel is once again a close second, but for Kayn I think it has to be Odyssey. Aatrox, the Darken Blade. Our final character in this roster, and I wanted to end on quite a big one. This would be a boss character, so they might start turning up at the end of arcade mode in place of Mordekaiser. As a boss, they would have their healing and damage cranked up to 11. He'd have Wreckers with Darkened Blade, a pull with his chains, and the ability to air dash with his wings. My only real worry with including Atriox is basically just making him a Riven 2.0, which was a relatively common complaint with his rework in the main game. As for which skin to include for him, my personal choice is Primordian. Actually, one more thing. Now that we have our full roster, here's a quick little breakdown of the roster's distribution by region, starting with the lowest and going all the way up to the highest. Some characters will be mentioned twice pulling double duty, and most of them originated from Shurima. First up, we have Bandle City, represented only by Yumi. Basically, it's just because they said they weren't going to be putting yodels into the game, so I think maybe we just make Bandle City a stage and have some of the yodels in the background. Maybe make Kled or Rumble playable at a later time. Up next, we have Ishtal with 2 representatives, first being represented by Kiana, and then later getting Rengar as one of the post-launch characters. Mount Targon is up next, being represented by Pantheon and Leona in the base game, and then getting Diana later as part of post-launch content. Up next, we have the Void being represented by 3 fighters, Kha'Zix, Malzahar, and Kassadin. There's 4 characters in this roster who aren't stated to have any particular home. However, 3 of them did originate from Shurima, but those 4 are Shaco, Jax, Cassante, and Atriox. Up next, we have Demacia being represented by Jarvan, Silas, and Shyvana in the base game, and then later Fiora and Galio as post-launch content. Next up, also with 5 fighters, is Bilgewater, with Illaoi, Nautilus, Misfortune, and Pike in the base game, and then Gangplank later. Moving out from Bilgewater, next we have the Shadow Isles, which is represented by Yorick, Thresh, Gwen, Viego, and Elise. However, I also want to include Shaco in here, because I feel like we can make some new lore for Shaco and actually give him a reason to exist. So my line of thinking is Shaco can be taken one of 2 ways. You can either fully make him a demon, like Tahm Kench, Evelyn, or Fiddlesticks, who just thrives on chaos, or you can take what little lore he currently does have and try to do something with that. So for Shaco's new lore, I would make him the toy of the young Prince of Camavor, Viego, infused with magic to give it life for a while and given as a gift by Viego's uncle. Being abandoned once the magic wore out and Viego became king, then given life again and part of Viego's soul in the Ruination. This way it explains why no one could really explain Shaco up until now, and ties him back to the Shadow Isles and Viego, while also giving him a tie back to Noxus. Maybe he has an inner conflict about wanting to either kill Viego or helping him, or maybe he holds a grudge against Viego's uncle who initially gave him life. While it does push Shaco away from being an unknowable murder clown, and more into the classic killer doll archetype, this new backstory would finally give him a place and connections to other characters, while also effectively making him kind of a dark mirror of Gwen, being to Viego what Gwen was to Isolde. Next up, we have the Freljord, being represented by Braum, Trundle, and Ornn in the base game, then getting Udyr, Sejuani, and Volibear as post-launch content. Next up, we have Piltover and Zorn. I'm pairing them together as the topside and underside of the city. Piltover and Zorn will be represented by Echo, Jinx, Vi, Ezreal, Jace, and Warwick in the base game, and then get Camille later as post-launch content. Shurima also has 7 fighters, being represented by Azir, Malzahar, Jax, Cassante, Renekton, Kassadin, and Atriox. But as previously stated, a lot of them also are pulling double duty for other regions as well. Next up is Noxus, being represented by 8 fighters, those being Darius, Katarina, Riven, Samira, Vladimir, and Mordekaiser in the base game, and then Ambessa and Elise as post-launch content. Maybe we could make the Immortal Bastion a stage in the game as well. And finally, we have Ionia, represented by Ahri, Yasuo, Lee Sin, Set, and Wukong in the base game, before getting Yone, Zed, Shen, and Kayn as post-launch content, bringing Ionia's final total up to 9. I did unfortunately have to cut a good few characters out of the roster, and some just barely missed the cut, so without going into their gameplay or anything, here's another 15 that just narrowly missed out for one reason or another. Blitzcrank, Xin Zhao, Dr. Mundo, Nasus, Akali, Irelia, Alistar, Cho'Gath, Master Yi, Briar, Zeri, Urgot, Ryze, Fizz, and Fiddlesticks. I'd also like to give special mentions to Lissandra, Swain, Graves, Shen, and Akshan, because while I was playing all of the arams to try to get footage, I ended up playing them quite a bit, and honestly considered adding them into the roster just because some characters, namely Ezreal, especially Ezreal, just weren't turning up. Seriously, not getting Ezreal for an aram pushed this video back by about a week. Now that I've covered the roster and a launch skin for all of them, there is another aspect of the game that I want to talk about before I wrap this up, and that is stages. In the Alpha Lab test, we had 4 stages to play on: a beach, assumably in Bilgewater, a bar in Bilgewater, a Bridge of Progress in Piltover/Zorn, and a stage in Ionia. So while I'm not going to be giving the entire roster their own unique stages, here's just a few that I would like to see, either for characters or for just Runeterra's history. A stage on Mount Targon that goes through day and night, showing the Solari and the Lunari. Maybe the other Targonian champions, so Taric, Aphelios, Zoe, and Aurelian Sol, maybe they make cameo appearances in the background of the stage. The Ionian fight pit. Set would be watching fights in the background if he isn't being played, kind of like how Shao Kahn does in some of his stages in Mortal Kombat. The Ruined King's Throne Room. It would be a very similar stage to the fight pit, only with Viego watching in the background. Maybe Lucian, Senna, Akshan, and some of the other Sentinels could fight him in the background, and while the match is going on. The Howling Abyss. League's ARAM map since the release of Lissandra, aside from when they had events for Bilgewater and Arcane, where it became the Butcher's Bridge and the Bridge of Progress respectively, where the Iceborne fought the Frozen Watchers. The Crystal Scar. Another long-lost relic of League of Legends history, it was the map for the long-since-removed Dominion game mode. It was a mining village before a war between Demacia and Noxus broke out for its underground riches. It also has important ties to the Bracken and Skarner in their original lore. Obviously these have been changed and retconned over time, but it would be a nice little thing to call back to League's history to once again. The final stage that I want to add is another special one from League's history that was removed from the game a few years ago, that being the Twisted Tree Line. The Twisted Tree Line was the map for League's now removed 3v3 mode, and that map was set on the Shadow Isles. I think we could also take another cue from Mortal Kombat here, with how it has alternate versions of some stages, and also have a version of the map that's the Blessed Isles version. This would show how it would have looked before the Ruination. Although I don't know what we would do about Vilemore on that version of the map, because on the original version of Twisted Tree Line, Elisa's god Vilemore was basically the Baron Nashor equivalent for that map. With that, we've covered a pretty big roster, a decent chunk of post-launch content, a few more potential stages, and a launch skin for each character. So I'm going to wrap things up here because otherwise this video, which is already probably really long, is just going to get even longer. With how bad Riot's corporate greed has been as of late, a $500 skin, $250 gacha skins, $200 chromas that they're pretending are brand new skins, taking away Hextech chests, which they eventually did go back on. All it took was several months of everyone yelling at them on every post they made, and also just blatantly lying to the community about the reason why they were removed in the first place. But now it's suddenly magically financially feasible after everyone complained about it. And also just a mountain of layoffs for incredibly talented people. Because of all of that, my current hopes for League of Legends are really low at the moment, but its world and characters are a great fit for a fighting game, and I really hope that 2XKO gets the time it needs to flourish, and doesn't wind up just swallowed by Riot's aforementioned corporate greed and egregious monetization. Because even just from the first run of the Alpha Lab, it's very clear that there is something great here. I hope you enjoyed this second episode of Figuring Out Fighters. I have a few ideas for episodes I would like to do in the future, so I'll definitely be making more. No guarantees on when the next episode will be though, since I have other projects that I'll also want to be working on as well, but hopefully I won't have as big of a gap as I did between this video and the last one. As always, feel free to leave a comment or click any of the buttons down below if you feel so inclined, and I'll hopefully see you again, either for an LP on my main channel, or for whatever the next video I have on here is. I still really need to finish that Does Anyone Remember on Persona 1, so it'll probably be that. Honestly, all I know is that I'm not going to be playing League of Legends for a while, because honestly I ended up playing so much of it for this video. Hopefully the audio in this video is at least a step in the right direction from where it's been previously. Okay, thanks for watching. Later.